Now we are going to move up from the brainstem structures, the most superior of which is going to be our midbrain, and we're going to move up into the structures of the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is comprised of three structures. We have the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus. We have the thalamus, which has two thalamic halves, segregated by the third ventricle. And here is our pineal gland. And we have the hypothalamus, which is not shown in this slide. So if we were to look at them on the model, we would look posteriorly, and we would look just above the superior colliculi. And as you remember, between the two superior colliculi and just above them, superior to it, we have the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus. Above that, anterior to it, we have the third ventricle. On either side of the third ventricle, we have the two thalamic halves, which would comprise these sort of egg-shaped structures, as you can see here and here. So this is part of the thalamus. And then anterior to that, we have the hypothalamus, which, as the name implies, is below the thalamus, which is this orange structure right here. And that's going to be in contact with a very important endocrine organ called the pituitary gland, which we'll get into a lot of detail later on when we study the endocrine system. So when we think about the diencephalon, we include these three structures: the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So let's start posteriorly and work our way forward. So we'll start with the epithalamus, and the main component of that is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is going to secrete a hormone called melatonin, which is important for regulating our circadian rhythms. And these are our sleep-wake cycles, and also important for regulating longer cycles, diurnal cycles, like the sleep-wake of cycles of lengthening of days and shortening of days in the winter. And some animals will actually hibernate in the winter, and then we tend to stay up longer, and we have different drives at different times of year. So springtime and fall, we all have different sort of drives and things that we're preparing to do. So if you're a bear in the fall, you're going to be eating a lot to get prepared for winter, and then you're going to hibernate through winter. In springtime, you're going to wake up and you're going to be thinking first about getting food and probably next about mating. In any case, in humans, it's going to regulate these diurnal and circadian rhythms. All right, next we have the thalamus. And the thalamus, as we've already seen, is important for relaying sensory information from the periphery, from our peripheral senses, to the cerebral cortex, where we will become aware of this information. And we call it a filter because it's basically going to filter out anything that's irrelevant, like background noise and background things that are going on constantly that are of little relevance to your survival or don't really need to be paid attention to. So if something suddenly, for example, a loud noise happens, and as we know, those reflexes are mediated through the inferior colliculus, but if we have a loud noise, well, that sensory information will be filtered through the thalamus and up into the cerebral cortex, where we will become aware of it. Notice our reflex to it will have already happened before we become aware of it, because the reflex is going to allow us to look at it and be able to determine where that sound came from. And then once we have determined where the sound came from, we can look at it and decide if it's a threat or not. So if it's some giant, big, mean dog barking, and we look over there and we see, the dog's in the neighbor's yard and it's on a chain behind a fence, I'm not going to worry about it, versus, oh my gosh, that dog is running full bore towards me and it's somebody's very angry Doberman Pinscher, then obviously we might have some different reactions once that information has reached the cerebral cortex. But in order to reach the cerebral cortex, it has to pass first through the thalamus. We're also going to see that the thalamus is going to mediate circuits between very important nuclei in the cerebrum that are going to be important for mediating ongoing motor movement as well. So along with the cerebellum, these basal nuclei, which are part of the cerebral hemispheres but are in deep nuclei, these are going to be important for adjusting motor tone, initiating motor movements, and so forth. And there are going to be circuits going through the thalamus between the basal nuclei up to the cerebral cortex. The thalamus, if we look at the structure of it, are these two egg-shaped structures on either side of the third ventricle here. So we can see this sort of egg-shaped structure here. And there's a little gray matter bridge between them called the intrathalamic adhesion. And this is going to extend through the third ventricle and join the two thalamic halves. All right, we've got several groups of nuclei within the thalamus. So we know that the thalamic halves themselves, the thalamic hemispheres, basically are a collection of gray matter processing centers. And just like anywhere else in the central nervous system, we call these gray matter processing centers nuclei. And we're going to have 5 main groups. We're going to have an anterior group that's going to be working hand in hand with a structure of the cerebrum that lies right on the border. And limbic means border. So this structure called the limbic system is part of the cerebrum that is on the border with the diencephalon. And indeed, the anterior nuclei of the thalamus are going to be highly connected with this limbic system. And the limbic system is going to be important for modulating emotions, mediating our reactions and responses to certain drives, reward behavior, this kind of thing. Now, the medial group of the thalamus is also going to provide awareness to the cerebral cortex of emotional states. And some of these inputs will be coming from other parts of the thalamus, and some will be coming from the hypothalamus. And since hypothalamus is strongly connected with drives and things like hunger and thirst and sexual drives, then these things will also be conveyed have importance for limbic structures because obviously reward and emotion are connected with our drives. Finally, we're going to have our ventral group, and that's going to relay sensory information from the periphery about pain, touch, temperature, vibration. We're also going to have some nuclei that are associated with relaying information from the cerebellum up to cortex, as well as the basal nuclei up to cortex. Basal nuclei, as we will see, are part of the cerebral hemispheres, and these are going to be deep nuclei that are embedded within the white matter tracts running through the cerebrum, and these nuclei are going to be important for putting together learned motor movement patterns, initiating motor movements. And very similar to some of the things that the cerebellum does, it's going to be mediating ongoing motor movements so that motor movements are smooth, so that they're coordinated. So we're going to coordinate a lot of our learned motor movement patterns into more complex patterns through the basal nuclei. And they will receive projections from the midbrain structures, from the substantia nigra. So they're going to receive some dopaminergic connections from the substantia nigra. And these basal nuclei are also going to be very highly affected in people who are suffering from Parkinson's disease. All right, let's look at the posterior group of the thalamic nuclei now. We're going to have the pulvinar, which is the very back of the thalamus. And we're going to have 2 nuclei that are sensory nuclei for vision and hearing. So we're going to have the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is going to relay information originating from the eyes, from the retina, and it's going to relay that information to visual cortex. And then we're going to have the medial geniculate nucleus, which will relay information from the ears about auditory sensation to the auditory part of the cerebral cortex. Finally, we're going to have the lateral group, which will also affect emotional states and help to integrate sensory information. So if we look at the structure here, this is one of the thalamic halves. Here we have our anterior group, which is going to be highly connected with the limbic system. We're going to have the medial group, which is going to relay information about emotional states to the frontal lobe here. And frontal lobes, as we'll find out later, are going to be very important for decision making. And obviously, your emotions, or how you feel about things, are going to affect the decisions that you make. So a lot of times you think through things. What do you want to have the outcome of your decisions be? And if the outcome is going to have a strong negative emotional implication, then you're likely not to do it. All right, we're going to look here at the pulvinar, which is the posterior part. That's going to be sending information, sensory information, to what we call the association area of the cerebral cortex. Here we have our visual input, our lateral geniculate nucleus, sometimes called the lateral geniculate body, and the medial geniculate nucleus right here, this yellow one, for auditory inputs. We're going to be receiving general sensation, touch, temperature, pain, this sort of thing, from the periphery is going to be relayed through this part of the thalamus. This will be bringing information from cerebellum, and this will be bringing information from basal nuclei to make connections up into the cerebral cortex. Now let's move to the hypothalamus, which, as the name implies, is the structure below the thalamus. So if this is our thalamus here, then all of this stuff is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to have two structures on the underside, one of which is called the mammillary bodies, which are related to controlling reflex eating movements such as licking. And they will also process things like olfactory and other sensory information. And these are so called the mammillary bodies because when anatomists saw them, they reminded them of boobs because they're two just outcroppings of tissue. Then we're going to have what's called the infundibulum, and infundibulum means funnel. And the infundibulum is going to be the very lowest part of the hypothalamus that connects the hypothalamus to this endocrine organ called the pituitary gland. Between the two, we're going to have the tubral area, and that too will help regulate pituitary gland function. Now let's look at the hypothalamus, its relationship to the thalamus, and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus sits under the thalamus. And we have several of these gray matter nuclei that are going to be involved in endocrine functions, autonomic functions, emotional states, and so forth. Well, let's have a look. If you remember from our very first discussion when we talked about regulation of body temperature, the control center for that is in the hypothalamus, and it resides in this area right here called the preoptic area. We're also going to have two nuclei that are going to be very important in making hormones that will be secreted by the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior part of the pituitary gland. And these hormones will be made in axons within these two nuclei. And here's one of them, actually, and here's the other. And so these two nuclei will be making hormones that will be transported down axons, but instead of being released by synapses or at synapses, will be released into general circulation, and they will act as hormones. So the first is the paraventricular nucleus, so named because it's on outside of the third ventricle. And this is going to secrete a hormone called oxytocin, which stimulates smooth muscle contractions in the reproductive tract, as well as the mammary glands. We will also see the supraoptic nucleus right here, which is going to release something called vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, which is going to prevent water loss by the kidney. So it will help the kidney retain water rather than excrete it in urine. Finally, we have this suprachiasmatic nucleus right here, which is going to help regulate circadian rhythms along with the pineal gland. All right, let's look at the 8 functions of the hypothalamus. Some of these are interconnected, but one of the things is going to provide subconscious control of skeletal muscle, and this is going to be involved in skeletal muscle reflexes and this kind of thing. We're going to have some autonomic function, that is things that happen automatically, so it's going to be the seat of what we call the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system controls things like breathing and heart rate and this sort of thing. We're also going to call it the neuroendocrine axis, and what that means, it's going to coordinate the activities of the nervous and the endocrine system. As we saw, the pituitary gland, which is part of the endocrine system, is directly connected to the hypothalamus. And not only do we have hormones that are made in the hypothalamus secreted via the pituitary gland, but we're also going to have hormones made by the hypothalamus that will directly affect the anterior part or the front part of the pituitary gland. And those hormones will be released into local circulation and will allow for the anterior pituitary gland, it will signal the anterior pituitary gland to release its own hormones. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get into the endocrine system. We will see that it secretes the two hormones that we already talked about, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And this is going to be secreted by the supraoptic nucleus, and that is going to be right here. And then we're going to have our oxytocin secreted by our paraventricular nucleus, which, as the name implies, is around that third ventricle. All right, so another thing it does is it produces emotional and behavioral drives, feeding, thirst, and so forth. It coordinates voluntary and autonomic nervous functions, regulates body temperature, and we saw where that happens in the preoptic areas, and also going to help control circadian rhythms, so our day and night sleep-wake cycles and so forth. And that is through that suprachiasmatic nucleus.